Welcome back to TESS'S Cryptids. Today we are taking a deep dive into sea serpent lore. These creatures have fascinated people for centuries, but can we really figure out if they're friend or foe?
Hmm, that's a great question. And a really complex one, too. Sea serpents are kind of unique. They're both monstrous and benevolent in mythology.
Yeah, it's like we can't make up our minds if we should be scared of them or worship them. Can you give us some examples of that, like that duality?
Sure. So on the monstrous side, there's the terrifying Jormungandr in Norse mythology. You know, Jormungandr.
I've heard of them. Yeah.
This creature is literally going to bring about the end of the world, it's said. It's a really powerful symbol of chaos and destruction.
Oh, yeah. Yermungandr is definitely in the foe category, I think.
That's
But you said there were benevolent sea serpents, too.
right. So, in some Asian cultures, sea serpents are seen as these wise, ancient beings. They guide lost sailors, they protect them from storms. They're revered as guardians of the sea, almost like some kind of benevolent deities.
So it seems like the image of the sea serpent really depends on the culture it comes from. Like, what could explain why there are these totally different ways of seeing them?
You know, I think it says something about how complex our relationship with the ocean is. It gives us life, it feeds us, but it can also be really dangerous and unpredictable. And those different aspects, I think, are reflected in how we see sea serpents.
That makes sense. The ocean is awe-inspiring, but also kind of scary, and maybe those feelings are projected onto these mysterious creatures. Um, but before we go too deep into the psychology of sea serpents, I'm kind of curious about the history of these legends. Where do they come from? Like, what's the origin?
Sea serpent myths are practically everywhere. Every coastal culture around the world, going way back to ancient times. We see them in Mesopotamia, in the Bible, Greek myths, Norse sagas. It seems like wherever there are people living near the ocean, there are stories about these serpentine creatures.
It's fascinating how widespread these stories are. It makes you wonder if there's something more to it than just coincidence.
It definitely points to our very human need to explain what we don't know. Imagine you're a sailor, say, centuries ago, and you're out there in uncharted waters, facing storms, all these unknown dangers. It's not hard to imagine that seeing something large and serpentine in the water could be interpreted as a sea serpent.
Right? So they're a way of making sense of the dangers and mysteries of the sea, like a way of coping with the fear of the unknown.
Exactly. And then naturally, those stories get passed down through generations, becoming ingrained in the folklore and mythology of these communities living on the coast.
It's like a cautionary tale, warning people to respect the power of the sea and whatever creatures might be living in it. Okay, so we've talked about how common sea serpent myths are in different cultures and time periods. Can you give us some specific examples of these stories that really, highlight the essence of these creatures?
Yeah, absolutely. One interesting example comes from Norway with the legend of Saint Olaf. He's their patron saint, and the legend says he met this massive sea serpent in a valley on the western coast.
Saint Olaf versus a sea serpent. That sounds pretty epic. What happened?
Well, Saint Olaf, being a saint, won the fight, obviously. They say he threw the serpent's body onto the mountainside, and some people even claim that you can still see the marks the creature left on Siltafjellet Mountain.
Yeah, okay, whether or not those marks are really from a sea serpent, that's a pretty striking image. It shows how much these stories are a part of a culture's history and its landscape. But let's go beyond the saints and legends for a second. Are there any accounts of sea serpent encounters from sources that we might consider more believable?
There are quite a few accounts from well-respected figures throughout history who claim to have seen these creatures themselves. Aristotle, for example,
Yeah.
the Greek philosopher and scientist. He described a sea creature in his book Historia Animalium that sounds a lot like a sea serpent.
Aristotle. That's interesting. He wasn't exactly known for making things up. What did he say it looked like?
Well, he didn't give us a ton of details, but the fact that someone like Aristotle, who was all about science and observation, even mentioned this creature, it suggests that there might be something real behind these stories.
It definitely makes the idea that these creatures might have existed seem a bit more believable, or at least that people really believed in them. Are there any other accounts that stand out to you?
Let's fast forward a few centuries to the 16th century. Olaus Magnus, a Swedish archbishop, was known for his writings about the Nordic world. And his description of a Norwegian sea serpent is, well, it's pretty vivid.
What makes his account so unique?
He goes into a lot of detail. He describes this serpent that's over 100 feet long. It has L-long hair on its neck, sharp black scales, and flaming red eyes. He even said it would come ashore and eat livestock, and sometimes even people.
Okay, that's definitely a picture of a more monstrous sea serpent. What was he trying to do by writing about this creature? Was it a warning or a scientific observation or something else entirely?
It's hard to say for sure, but given the time period and his position as an archbishop, his account was probably meant to be both a warning and a way of reinforcing religious beliefs. Sea serpents, like other monsters and creatures from myth, were often used to show the power of God and the dangers of straying from, the right path.
That's an interesting way to look at it. So these creatures were more than just scary stories. They were actually woven into how society worked, influencing people's beliefs and how they acted. But were all the accounts so focused on the scary side of sea serpents? Or were there other interpretations?
Not all the accounts are negative. Like we said before, some cultures actually saw them as good creatures. And even in the West, where they're often seen as monsters, there are stories that focus more on their size and strange appearance rather than them being aggressive.
So it's not always a simple case of monster versus human.
Exactly. There's a lot more to these stories. Like Bishop Erik Pontoppidan, a Danish-Norwegian bishop, he wrote a lot about sea serpents in the 18th century. He collected stories from lots of sailors, but he also questioned if they would actually attack ships or try to eat people.
So he thought they were real, but he wasn't convinced they were always dangerous.
Right. It seems like he was trying to figure out how to fit these seemingly crazy reports with what he knew about the natural world. He was a man of science and reason, but he was open to the possibility that there might be things out there that we just can't easily explain. And that's a struggle, that tension between believing and being skeptical, and it continues even today.
That's so true. And it leads to a big question, do sea serpents really exist? Or are they just in our imagination, or misidentified sea creatures, or elaborate hoaxes?
That is the question that keeps us coming back to these stories. And to get to an answer, we'll need to look at some of the most famous sea serpent sightings and really examine the evidence both for and against their existence.
Okay, I'm ready to take that plunge. Let's see if we can separate the truth from the myths.
All right, so let's dig into some of those famous sightings, see what we can learn from them. One of the most interesting cases comes from Hans Egede. He was a missionary sailing off the coast of Greenland in 1734. His account of the creature is super detailed. People are still talking about it centuries later.
I remember reading about Egede's encounter. He seemed like a really careful observer. What made his sighting so interesting?
Well, Egede described this huge creature with a long, sharp snout, wide flippers, and a body covered in scales. He even said it spouted water like a whale, which is kind of a key detail. It hints at a possible explanation for what he might have actually seen.
A whale. You think he might have mistaken a regular whale for a mythical serpent?
It's definitely possible. Egede and his crew were sure they saw a sea serpent, but some researchers think it was probably a giant squid.
That's a pretty big difference. How could they mistake something as, well, unique as a giant squid for a sea serpent?
It comes down to perspective and, the limits of what they could see at the time. Imagine you're on a ship in the 18th century, right? And suddenly, this massive creature pops up out of the water. You might only get a quick look at its head and a long, curvy tentacle. In that moment, with all the adrenaline pumping, it's easy to see how someone could think it's a serpentine monster.
Okay, yeah, in a moment like that, a giant squid could definitely look like something all more fantastical. But what about those stories where sea serpents are attacking ships? A giant squid, even a big one, couldn't take on a whole ship, right?
You're right, a squid by itself probably couldn't sink a ship, but a lot of those stories describe the serpent wrapping itself around the ship. And that detail, that could actually be explained by whales that have gotten tangled up in fishing gear or debris in the ocean.
Oh, so you're saying a whale struggling to get free from ropes and nets could look like a serpent trying to pull a ship under. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And this wasn't just something that happened in modern times either. Back in the days of sailing ships, they had these huge lengths of rope and rigging. If a whale got tangled in all that, it would be a terrifying sight.
I can only imagine. But some people described serpent heads rising high up out of the water. That doesn't really sound like a whale. Is there anything else it could have been?
There is. Have you ever heard of an oarfish?
An oarfish. Can't say that I have.
They're pretty amazing creatures. Really long serpentine fish. They can grow to over 50 feet long. They're not seen very often, but when they are, they swim near the surface, sometimes with their heads way above the water.
Wow, that's incredible. I can totally see how someone could mistake an oarfish for a sea serpent. So we've got giant squid, whales, and oarfish as possible culprits for misidentification. But if all these explanations make sense, Why are people still so fascinated by sea serpents? Why hasn't the myth died out?
I think there are a couple of reasons. First, the ocean is huge, and we've barely explored any of it. We've only mapped a tiny bit of the ocean floor. Who knows what could be living down there in those dark, unexplored places?
There's that saying, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about our own oceans. It really makes you think about how much we still don't know about what's going on underwater.
Right. And that mystery really sparks the imagination. It lets us hold on to the idea that there might be creatures out there that we just haven't discovered yet. And second, I think there's a psychological aspect to it. The thought of a giant, unknown creature in the depths of the ocean plays on our deepest fears and fascinations with the unknown.
It's the thrill of the mystery, the excitement of the unexplained. It's why we love stories about monsters and mythical creatures. But speaking of monsters, we can't forget about Albert Cook and his famous Hydrarchos skeleton. That was a big hoax, wasn't it?
It definitely was. Cook claimed he dug up the bones of an ancient sea serpent, over 114 feet long. He caused quite a stir when he took it on tour around America in the 19th century.
Sounds like something right out of a circus sideshow. What was the real story behind the Hydrarchos?
Scientists eventually got a look at the skeleton and figured out that it was actually made up of bones from a bunch of different whales, all arranged to make it look like one huge serpent.
A complete fake. What was Cook trying to do? Was he just a showman looking to make some money?
I mean, money was probably part of it, but I think it also shows how much we want to believe in incredible things. People wanted to believe that creatures like that really existed.
It reminds us that it's easy to be fooled, especially when someone's playing on our hopes and fears. But let's get back to some of the sightings that seem more believable. You mentioned the HMS Daedalus encounter earlier. What can you tell us about that one?
That one's really interesting because the person who reported it was the captain of a British Royal Navy ship, a pretty credible source. In 1848, he was sailing between the Cape of Good Hope and St. Helena, and he and a few of his officers saw a huge serpentine creature in the water.
A captain and his officers. That does make it seem more believable. What exactly did they say they saw?
They estimated the creature was about 60 feet long, with its head 4 feet out of the water. And they weren't the only ones who saw it. Several crew members backed up their story, saying the creature stayed in sight for about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. That's not just a quick glance. That's a long time to be watching something. What did they think it was? Did they believe it was a sea serpent?
Their first reports definitely sounded like they thought so, but like with a lot of these sightings, people have tried to explain it away as a misidentified whale or a big clump of seaweed.
It seems like there's always a simpler explanation, right? But even with those other possibilities, the Daedalus sighting is still one of the most convincing pieces of evidence that sea serpents might exist, wouldn't you say?
It is. And it's these kinds of sightings, the ones that are really hard to explain, that keep the legend going.
So where are we now? We've looked at some interesting historical accounts, we've talked about the chance of misidentification, and we've explored how much we still don't know about the deep ocean. Are we any closer to figuring out if sea serpents are real? So we've really gone deep into sea serpent lore, from the old myths to some surprisingly recent stories. But it feels like we're swimming in a sea of, information that doesn't quite add up.
Yeah, it's true that the evidence can be really hard to understand. We have these exciting historical accounts, some from people we think would be reliable, but then there's also the chance that they just saw something else and thought it was a sea serpent. Giant squid, whales tangled up in junk, even oarfish. It seems like there's an explanation for almost every sighting.
It's like trying to catch something really slippery. You
Yeah.
think you've got the truth figured out and then it slips away. But even with all those more, rational explanations, something keeps pulling us back to the idea of sea serpents. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because we're just drawn to the unknown, you know? The ocean is so big and we've explored so little of it. Who's to say what might be hiding down there in the dark?
Yeah, that's a point you've made before, and it always gets me thinking. We can map the moon, but we still know hardly anything about our own oceans. That feeling of mystery is just so strong.
It really is. And that feeling of wonder is even stronger when you think about the historical accounts that are really hard to explain. Sightings like the one from the captain and crew of the HMS Daedalus, even if we say they might have seen a whale or seaweed, those stories still make us think, what if?
It's like a puzzle where we're missing a few pieces. We see hints of something amazing, but we just can't put the whole picture together.
So where does that leave us? Are sea serpents real, or are they just something we've made up? I don't think we can say for sure. The evidence isn't clear enough. And maybe that's the best part of looking at these myths and legends. It's not always about getting a definite answer. It's about asking questions, challenging what we think we know, and trying to understand the world better, both the real world and the world of imagination.
I like that. It reminds us that even now, when we have so much technology, there's still room for wonder and mystery.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe someday we'll finally figure out the truth about sea serpents. Maybe it's a creature we haven't discovered yet, or maybe it's just a story that shows how powerful our imaginations can be. Either way, it's a story that keeps us fascinated.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our exploration of the world of sea serpents. I hope you've enjoyed the journey with us. What do you think about sea serpents? Do you think they're real, or are they just something our imaginations have created? Go to the TESS'S Cryptids social media pages and tell us your theories. Until next time, keep an eye on the horizon and be open to the wonders of the unknown.